Thank you, Choir. The President of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, past presidents, vice presidents, the council, fellows, your excellencies, honorable ministers of states, and members of parliament, the family of J.B. Danquah, dear students, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Yesterday, we heard about the Family Our Nation, an agenda for the 21st century, which was our theme and still our theme. And we focus on the family in past perspectives, focusing on the crystallization of the family in Africa and looking at some of the family life in indigenous African cultures. Today, we're moving from the past to look at the family in contemporary times, especially in era of modernization. Mr. Chairman, in recent times, the family has attracted increasingly more attention. This is due to the critical role it plays in development and the enormous transformations that have taken place in social interactions, creating formidable challenges that increase pressures on the family. Among the greatest impetus for transformation in the family is the changeover in the country from subsistence to cash crop farming, which generated job mobility long before the onset of industrialization. Perhaps even of greater import for the family was the alternation was the fundamental alternation and power structure of the African people imposed by colonial administration and education. Laws hostile to family, indigenous practices rocked the foundations of the family system. Despite the important roles these have played in disorganizing and destabilizing the indigenous Ghanaian family, it is widely believed and accepted that the single most fundamental process that has transformed the family is urbanization. Defined as a process that leads to the disproportionate growth of the population of particular settlements, urbanization occurs through two main trigger activity and processes. The first is, of course, the usual rural-urban migration. The other is through natural increase in the population, where birth and death are natural causes of population change. The urbanization process culminates into expansion of cities with ramifications for urban families. With unprecedented population growth and migration, increase in urban settlements and sprawl are unavoidable. More and more towns and cities bloomed, with a change in the land use, along with the myriad landscapes, and ecosystems to the extent that today urban families can boast of living under a wide range of climatic and environmental conditions. In the year 2014, the United Nations estimated that nearly 70% of the human population, especially those in cities of developing countries, will be urban dwellers by the year 2050, with close to 90% of the increase taking place in Asia and Africa. In the latter, it is estimated that the growth of cities will be the single largest development in the 21st century. The African urbanization experience. Africa's urbanization is occurring faster than that of any other continent. And very soon, some African families will live in cities rather than in rural areas. Urbanization level, which was about 14.4% in 1950, increased to as high as 35.7% in 2000 and 39.2% in the year 2010. This figure is expected to rise sharply by 57.7% by the year 2050. The process is uneven across the various sub-regions and countries and remains perhaps one of the debated issues in African urban studies literature. Ghana, as a country, has always been relatively urbanized compared with other African countries. In the year 2010, Ghana's urban population has also contributed in Ghana's urbanization in contemporary times. In Ghana, urbanization embraces a diversity of more concrete social processes, such as a direction of population movement and reordering of institutional interchanges. In other contexts, it provides a shift in attitudes and values of movement towards a specific type of solidarity and societal integration. In the process, the extended family, characterized by ascription, particularism, and diffuseness, places due restraints on the mobile labor force demanded by the expanding economy and interferes with efficient functioning. According to W.J. Good, the family structure, as a result, changes to meet the requisites of a changing status order. This means that as the family size decreases, the youth are accorded considerable freedom and little allegiance to any extended unit as expected. The family also loses or relinquishes many of its former functions, both in terms of its structure and functions. The family, under the impetus of urbanization, is comparatively small and has fewer functions and is relatively isolated. There is high geographic and social mobility based on merit and achievement, and conjugal family is the basic unit of residence and domestic functions. Now, emergence of the new family and contemporary challenges. In the process of modernization, two revolutions have been identified as confronting the family. The first revolution is taking place inside the family, where changes in sex roles, which have increased women's participation in the paid labor force, are now challenging the rules underlying the indigenous marriage system. As a result, many wives resent putting in double day of employment and housework, while many husbands still resist their wives' urgings to share in family chores. The second revolution is going on outside the family, where unmarried people are experiencing the privacy, dignity, and authority of living in their own home rather than living in a family as a child, relative, or lodger. The first revolution is putting pressure on families to change by limiting the time and energy women have available for traditional family tasks. So slowly, new families are being formed in which men and women are expected to share family and economic responsibilities, as well as domestic tasks that ensure that family members go to work and come home to a place where they provide each other care and comfort. The second revolution, in which unmarried adults live independently, is providing an alternative to change by giving men and women the opportunity to avoid marriage or living in families at all. This position we call no families. With the transformations going on in the workplace, as women increasingly join men there, many social scientists assume that the home will gradually be abandoned. Are we heading for new families, or are we heading for no families? Family structures are changing all over the world, and so is Ghana. Although there's general agreement that these changes have something to do with globalization and urbanization and the ensuing transformation of the material basis of individual subsistence, it is nearly impossible to disentangle cause and effect in this process of the simultaneous revolution of economic and family structures. The transition from a society in which status and family constitute the basis of social security to a society in which survival and success are based on merit is leading to disintegration of the family. In Ghana, for example, the percentage of women living together in consensual union is rising, as you can see in Fig 3. The percentage of married women has declined from 64% in 1988 to 42 in 2014. And more women are becoming single than married. From 1988 to 2014, the percentage of single women declined. More women became single in 2014 from 1988, when there were only 19.8 people who were single. In 2014, it rose to 32.9%. There's also increasing divorce and separation. From 1988 to 24, the percentage of married women declined from 64% to 42%. And percentage separated women rose from 2.7 to 4.8% in 2014. Increased female education is also an added factor. This is reducing adherence to indigenous family roles. With more education, young women make firmer plans for working during adulthood. They delay marriage, they delay childbearing, but also generally express greater approval for mothers working. The effects of male education, however, appears to support marriage. Yet, it is only in the most educated families that the children's role in the family appears to be minimal. Educated families not only delay childbearing and expect fewer children, they all also are least willing or able to incorporate their children in the everyday activities of the household. This results in a pattern in which fewer children are exposed to more egalitarian marriages and gaining little practical experience in the domestic skills needed to make such a marriage successful. The forces that lead to a reduced role for children in the household seem to be strengthening. They are strengthening in society as a whole, affecting not only educated families, but also younger women's traditional roles have been described as pro-family. They emphasize the importance of marriage and motherhood and encourage women to work hard at the difficult task of maintaining family relationships. So many scholars have argued that those women with less traditional perspectives will not put as much effort into keeping family relationships working, and this will lead to poorer family functioning at all levels, more breakdown of relationships, and perhaps a poorer prognosis for the success of the family in the next generation. It is also the case that indigenous sex role orientations are anti-family, in the sense that such attitudes encourage men to put career success ahead of everything else and reinforce the idea that women's work, that is family work, is inappropriate and even demeaning for men to do. Since fewer and fewer wives feel the traditional wife role of working only in the home, many resent the woman's double burden, which increases the chances of marital discord and marital breakdown. The real threats to family, it seems, have been totally ignored in the inordinate concentration on women in the workplace, thus supporting the notion that the real challenges of the family are in the home. Again, children, particularly sons, but increasingly daughters, are not being taught the fundamental skills that underlie making a home. If men and women in the last generation have had difficulty sharing home tasks because of men's lack of training and experience, it may be that the young men and women of the future will have even less confidence about their ability to take them on, thus leading to a dramatic decline to children's involvement in household tasks, while others provided more hope for homes in the 21st century. As children grew into adolescence, multiple life transitions, such as frequent changes in family care and residences, prompt children to become independent change agents who attempt to gain more control over their own lives by leaving home. The resultant life on the street is one of survival, as these things tend to conventional and deviant subsistence strategies and social networks of similarly troubled teens. Without the benefit of relative adult influence, supervision, and resources, the youth suffer critical developmental consequences from the problems with which they are confronted. Though they may suffer from problems attributable to experiences in their family of origin, it is also attributed to those stemming from a vulnerable life on the streets. The increasing rise in streetism in the urban centers implies more adolescents are becoming homeless without urban dwelling place they can call home. As parents work away from home, there tends to be a virtual absence of dominance of parents over children, and instead, there are relatively egalitarian relations within the nuclear family in ideals and practice. According to Slovak, the advancement and economic gains of individuals prevail over kin obligations. There is an ideology of individual rights, equality, freedom, and self-realization within the family. When we relate these suggestions to the contemporary Ghanaian family experiences, many issues arise, but we cannot ignore all, or at least some of them. Taking, for instance, this upper socioeconomic class, the typologies are more reflective among the middle class than the lower class, which appears to be steeped in their indigenous practices. The same picture is depicted when we view it from the dimension of the rural-urban dichotomy. Whilst the urban area appears to manifest most of these changes as typified by modernism, in quotes, the rural areas appear to conform to the indigenous norms and practices. With modernization, there comes a shift in attitude towards family size, as urban families were compelled by rising costs in family maintenance to reduce the family size. Polygyny, previously the most widespread type of marriage, as we saw yesterday, is becoming less prevalent. The percentage of all women in polygamous union decreased from 34.5% in 1979 to just a mere 15% in 2014. So Ghana is moving away from polygamous marriages. As per the Ghana Demographic Health Survey of 2014, only 15% of all women are in polygamous marriage. One major contributory factor is the serious challenges that emerge in the urban environment in an attempt to maintain a plural household. The cost of maintenance is becoming increasingly higher and even unbearable. Related to this is the prevalence of consensual union and single motherhood in the urban centers. The social process, as well as economic and territorial ones, are transforming the indigenous role of the family, relationships within families, and concepts of individual and social responsibility. The nation cannot go on functioning well unless it protects its family. Hence, the disintegration of the family is a threat to our social cohesion and our national development itself. And now the family and urbanization, urban sprawl and housing. The faster the rate of urbanization, the more stress on families and their living arrangements. As Ghana gets more urbanized, the regions are affected unevenly, with Greater Accra leading with 90.5%, followed by Ashanti with 60.6%. The greatest regional disparity could be found between the southern and northern regions that are least urbanized. Similar patterns of urbanizations are reflected at the citywide level. Since the 1970s, a few cities like Kumasi, Accra, Sekondi Takoradi, and Tamale have recorded a considerable increase in their population, as you can see in Fig 4. And cities such as Accra and Kumasi have a population growth rate of over 4.5 per annum, with a high urban growth rate. The very rapid rate of urban growth negatively affects the family and housing provision, as well as the productivity of the cities, hence reducing the extent to which they can effectively perform their role in national development. The unprecedented urban growth requires that adequate housing, which is a basic necessity for every family, be provided for the ever-growing families and population. Modern urbanization in Ghana is focused mainly on big cities, around which the central cities are fast-growing suburban areas like Ashaiman in the case of Tema, and Medina and Kasua in the case of Accra. Such a rapid and uncontrolled urbanization requires that adequate amounts of housing be provided to accommodate families and individuals, as the increasing numbers of families are confronted with the decision of securing the most decent residential location. Housing, as one of the most basic needs of mankind, has profound effects on the health, social attitudes, and the productivity, and on the family. Stable housing regimes equally confer multiple socioeconomic advantages on households and families, and the incidence of housing relocation. The quality of families' housing may be one of the best indicators of one's standard of living and a place in society. Thus, expenditure on housing constitutes the largest single investment that most families make in life, as the urban market is poorly developed and demand exceeding supply. Modern urbanization in Ghana, centered mostly in the metropolitan areas and large cities, and accommodate urban families with varied socioeconomic backgrounds and at different levels. In Accra, urbanization and residential mobility in the city occurs towards the Tema Municipal Assembly and the Ghana District. As a private city and also the financial, economic, transport, and industrial hub, Accra offers the best example of urban family residential mobility. colonial times and thereafter, successive governments have therefore made several attempts to provide housing for low-income and middle-income families. Notable among them were the efforts of Kwame Nkrumah, whose timely intervention targeted laborers as well. To achieve his targets, he established the State Housing Corporation, Ghana National Housing Corporation, and the Tema Development Corporation, among others, to implement his housing policies, through which important strides were made. But unfortunately, most of the activities were stalled. In addition, through the government's National Comprehensive Shelter Strategy, the state made other efforts to promote housing development that can take place in a coherent and sustainable manner. Various public housing agents were subsequently established, including the Prefab Concrete Products and the Department of Rural Housing and Cottage Industries. Thereafter, subsequent governments also introduced additional interventions, including the Smith Flats projects introduced by Rawlings and the affordable housing projects by Kufuor and Mahama. All these attempted to reduce the housing deficit to some extent. Nevertheless, all these efforts notwithstanding, the question of bridging the housing deficit gap still remains due to the affordability of the housing unit, cost of construction materials, lack of continuity on the part of successive governments, and sometimes litigation over acquisition of land. Even with those houses that managed to be completed, the issue of affordability has not been quite clear, making it difficult for the target groups to afford purchase. With these distractions in the efforts of policymakers, the private sector and GREDA have largely been responsible for provision of residential dwelling for families and households. But the kind of houses produced is a function of housing demand and the kind of houses produced by landlords. The quality of services available within the house and its surroundings naturally impinge on the cost of housing. This meant that the existing private housing market does not tend to favor low-income households that constitute the majority of households and families in the urban sector. With inadequate incomes, households are unable to adequately transfer their real housing needs into effective market demand. Now, urban families in inner cities and indigenous residential areas. In Accra, urban families, most of whom are low-income families, reside in the metropolitan areas in one of three types of residential areas, namely the indigenous residential area or the inner city occupied by the Gan, the indigenous people. Then there is the other residential area, the migrant area, popularly called the Zongo. And the third is the newly emerging areas that are springing up all over. The families in the indigenous residential areas are usually located within the city center, close to the CBD, that constitutes the original settlement before urbanization. The migrant residential areas are found adjacent to the indigenous areas and are mostly occupied by first-generation migrants. The newly emerging residential areas in the peri-urban areas of the towns and cities tend to be recent migrant families from rural areas. With the current escalation of urban sprawl, previous rural areas, which are rapidly becoming urban in character, and urban fringe communities are constantly being converted to slums by products of rural-urban migration. In the inner city and all migrant areas, lack of adequate infrastructure, lack of social services, overcrowding, and congestion are undermining the traditional influence of the cities. Abu Salia in 2015 has shown that 72% of all family dwellers invade public and private lands for the construction of extensions to their houses that fail to meet urban planning regulations. These urban dwellers live on their own for survival, security, and growth, leading to challenges towards improvement in the residential areas. In the metropolitan areas, like the Greater Accra metropolitan area, only a small percentage of urban families own their houses. The high rate of tenancy and the mobility of tenant families result in a high residential change each year. The outcome has been the rise in residential mobility, through which many urban families satisfy their housing needs. Some of the families could solve their residential challenges when they are able to change their residence. However, for various reasons, not all families can change their housing as needed. Challenges and opportunities of families living in slums. The livelihood of most slum families and households are generally concentrated around trading activities, though there may be farmers, artisans, and public service sectors in those settlements. The dubious nature of the legal status of families living in slum areas is a universal challenge facing families in low-income urban residential areas. Lack of tenure and land permits result in inadequate information and viability to municipal authorities to address the issue. The housing market in the metropolitan area, like Accra, is highly polarized and characterized by low-income families whose residential preferences and mobility patterns need to be well differentiated from the general housing mobility patterns. Some studies have shown that decisions to move or to stay in a particular residence are very complex and could be linked to a set of internal family structure and changing external context. Household life cycle, household life cycle stages, marital status, and children present in the household often trigger change in household size, economic status, residential tenure, and residential mobility behavior directly or indirectly. This implies that as household life cycle, as the household cycle, this implies that as the household cycle change and age and income advance, the predisposition to secure housing that meets their needs is created. This leads to a space of residential mobility. The pattern depicts both lifestyle and contextual external forces. Residential move among families, as you can see in Fig 5, could be voluntary or involuntary. And these can be categorized into three. They can be voluntary moves or adjustment move or induced move, depending on the level of freedom in decision-making of the family. The first moves are the adjustment and induced ones, and they are made by families to satisfy their residential needs and neighborhood desires. On the other hand, the involuntary moves are those over which the family has no control. These could be triggered by unaffordable rents, eviction, and risk to life and property. Generally, involuntary moves have been found to have strong relationships with housing tenure of tenants who are mostly victims of forced residential mobility. The phenomenon and frequency of residential mobility among urban families in Accra is so intense that scholars have described Accra as a city on the move. According to some studies carried out in Accra, 82% of urban families had moved within Accra at least once in a year or two. So you can imagine 82%, especially low-income families, moving from one residence to other because either of eviction or they could not afford the increasing and rising rents. On the whole, nuclear families, due to their small family size, have higher propensity to move than the extended ones. The family and urban living arrangements. The COVID-19 pandemic that hit Ghana on 12 March 2020, with the subsequent lockdown, as we all know, on 28 March 2020 raised a red flag on the deplorable living arrangements of urban families in the inner city and old migrant areas, and the critical concerns that hinder the capacity of the city authorities to respond to the global health crisis. The vulnerability of such families were unexpectedly heightened due to the combination of population density and inadequate access to water and sanitation, which made standard advice about social distancing and washing hands implausible. Stay home, social distancing, and good hygiene were key to slowing down the COVID. But these were also the three requirements that urban families and individuals could not and cannot afford, because most of them are poor and live in poor environmental congested spaces without any social support. Further challenges have to do with the lack of reliable data and the social, political, and economic context in each locational setting that influence vulnerability and possibilities of action. The wake-up call of the COVID pandemic has raised further pertinent issues. Taking into consideration the threat and future impact of climate change, its debilitating impact on agriculture and rural livelihoods, rural migration, and the growth of the energy sector as key drivers of urbanization, it is still plausible to predict an increasingly urbanized future for Ghana and Africa as a whole. The urbanization rate may increase because of environmental refugees due to climate change. Rapid urbanization continues to occur at the expense of underinvestment in agriculture and rural areas. At the same time, the combined effects of natural and population-induced hazards are causing migrant agricultural labor to migrate further to urban centers. These environmental changes could easily trigger further climate-induced rural migration for the youth and rural migration who may be forced to leave the land to pursue improved economic opportunities in the urban centers. In response to these threats, there have been state interventions for projects to promote sustainable urban development by 2030 and to establish development zones to provide affordable cities outside the existing conurbations. Under the National Urban Policy Framework, for example, there have been proposed plans to develop new growth pole centers, for instance, in Greater Accra and Sekedi Takoradi, to ease congestion in the major cities. Yet, with the emergence of gated communities and urban enclaving, it is uncertain to predict the trajectory of spatial patterns of urbanization and the character of individual metropolitan areas which may accommodate urban families. As some scholars like Owusu and Otin Abebio have proposed, with this type of development going on in Ghana, Ghana is likely to produce an urban society with a double face. One face will be characterized by world-class residential areas equipped with solid infrastructure and services that will be inhabited by the upper and middle-class families, like the gated communities we find at Regimanuel Estates or Manet or Apollonia City. These are reshaping the city with the rise of English in the cityscape. The other phase will be teeming cities composed of informal settlements, overwhelmed by the pressures of excessive congestion, inadequate sanitation and waste management, and poor housing that will be mainly inhabited by the low-income and poor families. The proliferation and growth of gated cities and satellite communities engender further urbanization and more splintering urbanization and more inequalities in our cities. Coupled with these and projected population trends of medium and large-sized cities in Ghana, and the key determinants of housing provision and future urban growth trajectories, bridging the housing gap between the deprived and affluent families will be an intractable challenge that policymakers will continue to grapple with for a long time to come. Now, with the unprecedented and uncontrollable urbanization and modernization have escalated revolution with the indigenous family, as we have seen from the beginning. They have also created, as it were, aggregated demand for accommodation and housing, mainly arising out of increase in family size and changes in marital circumstances and proximity to workplaces in the metropolitan areas. The absence and frequency of residential mobility of families, among others, have implications for urban policy and provision of decent housing in large and urban growing centers. Thus, I believe that policymakers should provide a comprehensive land use and regional growth management strategy that could be developed to avert unsustainable growth and its attendant negative impact on families. It should focus on densification and intensification strategies in core metropolitan areas aimed at securing inner city and low-income areas that provide more affordable housing for the ordinary family. The informal sector should also be further integrated into the formal, regional, and public health planning system. Mr. Chairman, as the challenges imposed by urbanization to urban families are intractable and multifaceted, families and individual citizens equally have pertinent and relevant roles to play so far as the urban environment is concerned. All family, household health and all should be conversant with the rules and regulations of their respective municipal and local authorities so that they could comply with them at all times. Families should equally uphold the positive indigenous values of decent living and purposefully promote and practice family stability values and efficient environmental management at all times. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on the Redeemed Baptist Church Choir, Obujo, to give us another song. Thank you. Thank you very much, Redeemed Baptist Church Choir, Obujo. I now call on our chairman for this evening, Professor Kofi Opokunti, to give his closing remarks. Thank you.
Let us give an applause to our speaker for a very wonderful talk. Sometimes many things happen right before our eyes that we don't really see. And what our speaker has done is to shed light on the evolution and the dynamics of the family. She traced for us some trends in terms of the size of family, the divorce rate, the what do you call it? Plural families, and all of that. But then she's telling us that when you look at the rural-urban migration, it is separating us into two different sets of settlements. What you might call the middle-class gated community settlements, and then the peri-urban settlements. And the dynamics are quite different. For example, she's telling us that inside the educated peri-urban, the gated community types, you are getting some changing gender roles, and the kids are being exposed to egalitarian kind of partnerships. And at the same time, the challenges in the peri-urban areas are stressing a lot of the families and putting a majority of people at risk. And the speaker tells us that we must consider this deterioration of the family as a social threat to our development. That, I think, is a very important message, that a lot is happening. She talked about the movements, the adjustment moves, the involuntary moves, and so on. And the amazing thing is that in a year or two, 80% of people have moved, right? So that is very, very unstable. And we should be looking for a scenario where people are moving into home ownership and settling and basically building more and more middle-class type society, as opposed to people fending on their own and not getting much support in growing the family. She also pointed out that there are some push factors that is pushing the migration, that if we ignore the impact of climate change, that it is also forcing people in the rural areas to have to move to the city. So it's not only the pull factor that the urban areas have more facilities or more attractions, but also if the farming and the means of livelihood in the rural areas are deteriorating, then people are being forced to move to the urban areas. And there's not much in terms of social network and social housing projects to support this kind of movement. So I think that she's highlighting the need for us to start to think strategically about the family as the unit from which the nation grows. And that we cannot just sit there and let the dynamics just take care of itself and deteriorate to the point where we lose control and maybe create very polarized environment. So I think this is really food for thought for policymakers, for social organizations, community groups, and so on, that we pay a lot of attention to the basic unit that makes for the community, that's the family. And I think we should thank our speaker for highlighting this phenomenon to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chairman Professor Okukunti, for those remarks. Another round of applause, please. Thank you. We have of the 2021 JB Danquah lectures. This course of the English. You'll agree with me that with this evening. A round of applause, please, for our distinguished speaker. Thank you very much. Let me thank the president of the Academy, all the previous or former presidents who are here or online with us, vice presidents. I see the vice president of sciences here, Professor Emerita Professor Isabella Kwachi, and of course, Professor Okukunti, who has chaired this function. I'd like to thank all the fellows who have joined us again today, here and online. Thank you all for making this evening another successful one. I'd like to thank all our invited guests who are here with us. We always welcome you because you help to make our events very well attended. The choir, Redeemed Baptist Church Choir, Obujo, you have done very well this evening by entertaining us with your music. We'd like to thank you very much for being here with us. And everyone else that I have left out, the staff, of course, of the Secretariat, and all the other staff present. Thank you, everybody else. Tomorrow, these lectures and at PM. Please join us again tomorrow. To ask you all to stand up while the procession leaves the room. Thank you.